pleasure to introduce the moderator for today, Derek Jones, Administrative Director, Linguistic Institute for Biomedical Innovation at Harbor UCLA Medical Center, who will start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Jones. I am the 2021 Vice Chair of the Select Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I would like to personally welcome you to our webinar series, which is our fourth installment, which is Disabilities and Isms, Racism, Sexism, and Ageism. I'm so excited today for today's programmatic content. Today's webinar will deal with the gritty reality of isms in the workplace. If any organization is overran by isms, everyone loses. The lively panel discussion will shed light on the impact of bias in age, race, differences in abilities, sex, and gender identity. When isms are present in an organization, people do not work to their full potentials. Teams are not as strong, communication is weaker, the consultations about important tasks that require collaboration and multiple perspectives might not happen. It is the goal of the DEI Select Committee to bring an awareness that provides a better understanding about how to combat these very common forms of biases. We have some very special panelists today, and I hope you've taken the time to read their bios. So I'm just going to introduce them. First, we have Dr. Trayshawn Hall Baker. She is the Dean of Human Resources at Santa Monica Community College here in the Los Angeles area. We also have Jami Caldwell, who is an external consultant at the University of Missouri-Columbia. We have our own Sam Westcott, who is the sponsored research manager for the Division of Physics, Mathematics, and Astronomy at the California Institute of Technology. Then we are pleased to also present Gerald Carroll, who is the author of the upcoming book on confronting racism. He's a speaker, a facilitator of difficult conversations, inclusive leadership coach, strategic storyteller, avid reader, musician, and a father of twins. Thank you all for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. And on that note, we shall begin our presentation with Dr. Trayshawn Hall Baker.
Hello, thank you very much, Derek. I appreciate you inviting me to this presentation, and I want to say how happy I am to be here. I also want to say thank you to all of the participants because this is very important work. Isms, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a step in the right direction to building relationships and creating a space that's welcome to creativity and to diversity and to change. And we want that in our spaces. Remember, if we don't change, we don't grow. So today we're going to talk about isms, and we're going to talk about some of those factors related to isms, which will give you an introduction that is important to understanding isms and how they work in our space. Some of those factors are diversity, equity, inclusion, and those spaces are, there's also biases. Some aspects of isms that we will talk about today include ageism, isms related to the LGBTQ plus environment, and then Jared will come in and wrap things up and discuss how to disrupt some of those barriers related to isms and how they operate in our space. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how what seems to be interchangeable terms are very different when we define them individually. So a lot of us hear diversity, equity, and inclusion together, and we don't expect to ask, or we don't even think about asking, what are the differences between the three? Well, you may hear very different definitions of the three terms, and I'm going to try to give you these three terms, how I see it in the simplest terms that I could think of, because sometimes you get scholars who want to put a lot into a definition, and I want to explain it to you in a way that makes it, you know, practical in the environment that you're currently working in. So the first term we're going to start with is diversity. Diversity is our identities and differences represented in a defined space. So for instance, if you work for an educational institution, we are looking at the diversity in that institution. And then sometimes diversity in the customers or students that we serve in that institution. Diversity can be quantified. That means that our differences can be counted and we can quantify that. We can look at numbers and say we have this percentage of, if we're talking about race, this percentage of African Americans, this percentage of Hispanics, this percentage of whites, and so on. So diversity can be quantified. We could also look at it in hiring patterns and some of the other stats that we need for diversity. So that's diversity. Now let's look at equity. Equity means that we're meeting those in our space that are different from us where they are. We are meeting people that will help us build equity in our environment and build the quality of our environment when it comes to our differences. So we're taking those differences when it comes to equity. We're meeting people where they are who are different from us, and then we're looking for the quality in those differences. We're saying that although we are all different, working together, we're getting away from what we feel is safe and normal for us, and we're crossing those barriers to affect change. Okay, so that's equity. Next, we have inclusion. Inclusion is essentially diversity in play. It's saying let's take our differences and let's see them thrive and grow in connection with each other. We are putting diversity in play. So we're saying we're all different. Now let's all dance together. Let's party together. Let's create together. And so that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. With inclusion, we're taking away the exclusivity, because we have these exclusive pockets we're in space, and we're saying we're taking away the exclusivity and we're making it inclusive. We're including all the differences into one big group. And it's important that all three work together, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that they work in concert so that we could defeat the challenges that come with isms in our space. And all of this has a lot to do with bias. And on our next slide, we're going to talk about what part biases play in having an organizational culture that is DEI focused on what I just explained as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's start by running a poll. And I'm going to ask the question just for fun, because I want to see where you all are on this. And that question is, do I have biases? Do I have biases? I'm going to ask everyone to participate. It's not a trick question. It's for you to tell me if you have biases. Now, I can tell you what my answer is, and I will, but I'm very interested in seeing where you all are on the question of, do I have biases? So please take a moment, think really hard about this question, and give me your best answer. It's either yes, no, or maybe. So let's see what you all think. Do you have biases? Are you all ready for my answer? Are you all ready for my answer? Should I wait? Panelists, should I wait for their answer before I give my answer?
Wait, let's see where they are first.
Let's see where they are. All right, we've closed the poll. Do I have biases? We have 80% saying yes. We have 3% saying no. And we have 17% saying maybe. Now, here's my answer. My answer is yes, I have biases. I have biases because I'm human, and biases are inherently a part of human nature. And how did your answer make you feel? If you said yes, if you said no, if you said maybe, how did your answer make you feel? Take a second and reflect on that. I'm going to tell you how my answer made me feel. It made me feel whole and human, whole and completely human. Because as a human, we are imperfect. And because we are imperfect, there is no way around having biases. Okay? So we're going to run the video. We're going to run a video that talks about biases. And then I want you to then again reflect on that question of whether or not I have biases. Thank you. So now I want you to reflect on your question again. Can you see how you may have biases and not even know it. Now, what are biases? Let's take a deeper dive into what are biases. Biases, simply put, are an unfair advantage or disadvantage towards something. So that thing could be a person, a place, a thing, a color, a race, an ability, a college, a store. It goes on and on. The list goes on and on. Again, like I said earlier, we all have biases. Whether we think we do or not, we all have biases. That is sometimes a cruel, hurtful reality for some. But once you admit that you have biases, they're easier to mitigate. And when you connect them to DEI and isms such as racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, etc., we could affect our mission of creating a DEI culture, meaning we find diversity in our environment. So like if we're in an environment that is mostly, let's say, white female, white cisgender female, we open our eyes to not looking for someone that looks like us, but looking for someone that will enhance our mission, our goals, or what we're trying to do in an environment. I live this all the time working for an institution of higher education in a community college, the California community college system. And I am able to, look at my biases in this environment, especially in HR, and checking those environments I have as a Black woman, as an African American woman. I'm able to look at those biases and check them when I'm dealing with individuals that are different from me. Some examples of biases that you may find in yourself and in your environment are like the affinity bias. The affinity bias is one where we identify with people who have like worldviews as we do, such as they went to the same college I went to, so they must be a good person. Or they shop at the same store that I shop at, so they must be a good person. They live in the city that I live in, so they must be perfect for this job. There's also the conformity bias where we want to be accepted, so we just go with the flow. We accept what everyone else is doing because we want to be accepted by the group and we want to be just like the group. And so there's that conformity bias. Another type of bias is the halo or the horn bias. It means that maybe you had a bad experience with, let's say, African-American male. And so every time you see an African-American male, you feel that they're going to treat you the same way. Or you had a great experience with, let's say, a Latinx woman, and that Latinx woman gave you a great experience in the workplace, of course, and you feel like that person, that type of person will always be good. So that's the halo and the horn bias. Halo being good, horn being bad. So the list of biases go on and on and on. It's a whole presentation in itself. However, it's important to know that biases ultimately fall into two general categories. You have your explicit bias and your implicit bias. Explicit or conscious bias are those that are deliberate and are a part of what you believe. It's something that you are not afraid to blurt out loud. However, it's still a bias. You then have that implicit or unconscious bias, and that was one of those biases talked about in the video where it just happens organically inside of you, and sometimes you don't even know that biases is happening. It is triggered by something in your brain that could be a part of your worldview, your upbringing. It's something that's inside based on an experience. So you want to be really careful of those implicit and unconscious biases because they happen even when you don't know it. Both types of biases, like I said, are established by both your worldview and your experiences, but there are many different ways that biases present themselves in your psyche, in your workplace, so be really careful. So let's talk about, on the next slide, how we mitigate those biases. We mitigate those biases that we have by bracketing, and I'm sure some of you may know what bracketing is. It's intentionally identifying those biases that you may have, maybe through journaling or writing them down, and checking those biases before going into those spaces. You check them. You say, you know what? I know I feel this way about fill in the blank. So let me check them here before I move forward with what I'm going to do, or the decisions I need to make. Okay. I have to do this all the time when we're going through hiring processes. I have to remind those that are on these hiring panels that you need to identify those biases intentionally. Don't be embarrassed. You don't have to share them with anyone, but just identify them, acknowledge, and then set them aside. Think about how you could deal with those biases to suppress them, because they don't necessarily go away, but you definitely can suppress them. Being intentional helps us change oppression of those isms that we're going to talk about, and many other isms. We change them to opportunities when we set aside our biases and we recognize that we need to be DEI focused. We have to be open up to building relationships with those that are different from us. We have to be intentional about changing our mindsets and organizational culture. We need to embrace the differences and engage in positive conflict management. What does that mean? Don't be afraid that someone's different from you or have different ideas. Because again, when you have that creative conflict and it's working in good concert, you have a creative outcome. So look forward to that positive conflict and those creative outcomes. And again, practice bracketing, practice acknowledging, reflecting, and setting aside our biases so that we could focus on the great work of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we could suppress any isms we may have. Thank you.
Very good, Dr. Baker. And I have one question for you in regards to that. As a practitioner in this area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you typically see that it manifests itself in your day-to-day?
I see it manifest in my day-to-day because I work for a community college that is Hispanic, Hispanic facing institution in a whole system that is the same. And so many times when we look at the stats, the diversity, the stats in our environment, we find that our faculty that are serving the students are very different in appearance as far as stats are concerned based on our student population. And so the way it manifests is we are trying to help our faculty hire peers that reflect our student population. And that takes a change of mindset. It takes a change of mindset because a lot of people unknowingly have that affinity bias where they want that person with the PhD, although a minimum quals only require a master's. And they want that person because they have a PhD, and the only person that can do the job is that person with the PhD. So we have to teach them that we need someone who can serve our students first, and someone who is great to our institution that may be different from you and may reflect our student population.
Very good. Thank you so much for your input. And we look forward to hearing from you later in the discussion.
Sure thing.
Now, move on to Jami Caldwell.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Hall Baker. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. So we're going to shift this a little bit, and how do we apply this to research administration and disability and isms and racism, sexism, and ageism. So I'm going to focus on a couple of different topics, particularly in disability and ageism. Next slide, please. So disability and research administration, and we want to focus and talk about accessibility and inclusivity. You know, understanding a person's disability, whether it's walking or standing or sitting or visual or otherwise. I mean, we do have a number of folks that's in our profession that has a disability, and I learned this firsthand in terms of recruiting and hiring individuals when you didn't really know, because you can't really ask that in the interview process, and so you find out afterwards individuals need they have special needs, and so people with disabilities need to feel included and comfortable with their physical disability and ability in the workspace. They are gifted, they're talented, they contribute to the work space and the work culture. And also from a physical environment, we have to make sure that we have the technology and the equipment that will broaden a person's accessibility and capability in carrying out their duties and performing research administration. Next slide, please. So we're gonna take a poll, and when we talk about leaders in research administration, a couple of different things we want to focus on. When we talk about ageism and we talk about leaders in research administration, most leaders in research administration are over the age of what? And so we have several different choices for you to choose, and think about it. In terms of the organization, particularly with the National Council of University Research Administrators, and attending the various conferences or back at home at our home institutions and working with our colleagues and peers, what would you say the age groups are? Is it 65, 55, 45, 35, or 25? Think about that, and we'll give you a couple of seconds to choose your answer. I know for myself, I've been in the profession for a long time, but I won't necessarily date myself. But the field has grown and it has changed over the years. So think about that in terms of leaders. When you look at your peers and you look at the folks back at your institution, or when you go to meetings and you look at people around the conference and around the room, what are their ages? So we'll give you just a couple of more seconds to choose your answer. So what do we think? Great. It says, so the polling results are in, and it says 3% are 65 or older, 26% are 55 and maybe older. Wow, 49% is 45, 18% is 35, and then you have the four. Those are very, very good answers. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but that's right around the correct numbers in terms of what I look at the population of folks in the research administration space. So thank you for answering that question. Next, please. So we have another poll question, and it sort of speaks to whether or not you can be a leader in research administration, or you cannot be a leader in research administration if you are under a particular age. And so once again, it's pretty broad. And so we have 4 different choices for you. So you can't be a leader if, it's kind of rhetorical, you can't be a leader in research administration if you are under the age 55, 45, 35, or 25. And again, determining your peers, your colleagues, folks you work with at your own institutions, when you look at who you consider a leader, what are the age groups? Give you a few more seconds to determine your answer. Okay. Are we done? Okay. So you cannot be a leader in research administration if you're under the age of 55, 2%, 45, 2%, 35, 12%, and 25, 85%. Wow. So are we saying that individuals who are just coming into the field, 25, either above or under, right around that particular age group, can't be? Well, that's not necessarily true, and there's no right, again, there's no right or wrong answer. I just wanted to give individuals something to think about when we talk about leaders and research administration. Next slide, please. So what is ageism, and why does it matter in research administration? Oftentimes we hear people in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, when we talk about training, and topics like racial bias and gender equity typically come to mind. However, age is often the forgotten protected class when it comes to creating an inclusive workplace, particularly in research administration. Ageism, we always are stereotyping folks. One of the things that we have been discussing among the panel, when we look around and we see who are the research administrators that we work with, and we look at a different, from different lenses, in terms of the groups on a basis of their age. Ageism can take many different forms, including prejudicial attitudes, discriminatory practices, or institutional policies and practices that perpetuate stereotypical beliefs. Ageism is modern in the workplace. Today's organizations are multi-generational more than ever. I mean, with baby boomers, Generation X, and all those individuals working together. Next, please. So the one thing that I have always thought in my long career in research administration, having started very, very young in the field, is that, one of the things I had people who mentored me and individuals who would always tell me, never let anyone tell you that you're too young or too old to move up the career ladder in research administration. And oftentimes, I think Dr. Hall Baker kind of alluded to in terms of having a particular background or degree, and someone will tell you whether or not you're qualified to take a particular position or not to take a position. If you feel you're qualified and you feel that you've put in the work and you feel that you know what it takes to do the job, you should not take a position or what you're most comfortable with, but you should. And so you should always pursue your dreams, always display your passion, and always with an attitude of, yes, I can. And remember, in the profession of research administration has grown over the past 20 years and will continue.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Sam Westcott.
I need to write this down. Unmute yourself. I'm very careful about not muting myself, and then I did it too long. I was thanking the earlier panelists and Derek for this opportunity. There was a session that we did recently. My colleague at University of North Carolina, Joanna Foland, and I did a session about this at the annual meeting, and much of this comes from that session. And Joanna gets a ton of credit for putting this together, because Joanna brought the idea forward of doing a session on dealing with queer people in the workplace. And we talked about it more from like, how do you intersect with students, faculty, staff, and those going through different gender definitions, gender identities. And it was really informative and interesting and created a lot of questions. And what it reminds me is that there are a lot of questions about this. And this is one of the areas that has been a little bit more open and discussed of late. And people are being a little bit more open about where they fall in terms of gender identity and in terms of the spectrum. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how you can fit that into the whole DEI conversation. So talking about accessibility and inclusivity, you have to remember that everything is on a spectrum. And one of the things that we get into the challenge of, and we understand this as research administrators really well, is that people start to think of everything as a binary, right? It's either zeros or ones, it's black or white, we should have yes or no. And yet research administrators have an entire profession that's built on nothing more than the absolute need to understand that things are on a spectrum, that it's the questions that live in the gray that really fund us and keep us going as a profession, because we are the ones who have to figure out when it isn't a yes or a no clear question. Well, everything is on a spectrum, including sexuality and gender identity. So a person can identify as feminine expressing, but it doesn't necessarily identify with the gender that they identify with. And being attentive and respectful to every person's identity is important in all of their identities. And while I'm talking about this from a perspective of gender identity, it's really important for you to be open to accepting anybody's identity and where they are on that spectrum, where they are in terms of physical capabilities, where they are in terms of their own cultural or racial identity. All of those spectrums are important because it all leads down to who the person is as an individual. And if we can't bring our whole selves into work, then the work is creating an environment where we're not allowed to thrive, because we do our best work when we can bring our whole selves. So I want you to just take a moment and kind of consider how you promote LGBTQI plus inclusion as part of your work. So when we talk about the LGBTQI plus, and we get a lot of, that it becomes like an alphabet soup. I will tell you, as a queer person, when I came out in the 90s, I had this vision of the future. And my vision of the future was that the labels would fall away and we would just be who we are. And that's a simplistic, naive view of the world, because what's really happened is that people have said, no, give me the labels. I want the identity. I want to be able to say who I am. I want to be able to be clear about who I am as a person. And I love that. So there are a lot of different labels, and people will take the labels and apply them as they see fit. You don't get to apply labels on someone else. They get to apply labels on themselves. And what you need to do is create space that makes it open and welcoming for someone to be any label and be who they are within the workspace. So I, as a queer person, use the word queer because queer sometimes makes people uncomfortable. And if I can adapt it and I be comfortable with it, then other people who are queer might be able to be comfortable adapting it, but it also might help others to be comfortable with it, because maybe they're comfortable with me. So if they're comfortable with me as a queer person, maybe then by affinity bias, they'll be comfortable with someone else as a queer person. I also identify as gay. I use the word lesbian. I have used the word bisexual because I did date men, but I've been with the same person for 25 years. All of that is all part of the spectrum. And now the spectrum's gotten even broader. And that's why this little credit to the group that put this rainbow together. But of course, the rainbow's never finished, because just like in science, we're always discovering like what's at the next level or what's between the lines. It's the same way that we're discovering that with our own identities. So why does this matter in research administration? Well, first of all, it creates barriers that affect both the physical and mental well-being of a person. Jami talked about physical disability. If a person cannot, for example, have a keyboard that allows them to do their job proficiently, it doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing the job. It means that they need the right tools in order to be able to do the job. And as research administrators, one of the things I love about my institution, in particular, CalTech, is that it gives me really great tools in some ways to be able to do my job. So if I have a faculty member who needs information, I can get that information very quickly. They support me in many ways by giving me the tools that make it easier for me to do my job. They don't put barriers in the way, certainly not intentionally, but they also don't put barriers in the way for me to be proficient in my field. You also need to create opportunities for you to not put barriers in the way of somebody's physical or mental well-being. Because a person, for example, may have anxiety. They may be perfectly good at performing their job, but they may need to have some conditions set up in the workspace to make it easier for them to deal with their having anxiety. It's the same way with gender. We need to create places that are welcoming and inclusive, not unwelcoming and exclusionary, because those practices mean that your team members won't bring their whole self to work. They may not engage with other coworkers because they feel that there's biases against them or that they're not welcome. They may hold back on sharing ideas and contributing because they may feel that it comes from their personal experience, that they don't feel safe in sharing. The fact that I am perfectly safe wherever I am with being an out person makes a huge difference in my world. I've known Jami Caldwell, for example, for decades. I've known Derek for years. I've been out to them for years. Never had any issues about that. Because I feel safe with them, I always bring my full self into our conversations and our collaborations. If I didn't feel safe, I probably wouldn't be able to be as productive, because I would feel that there's other things that are keeping me from being able to do my job. In order to create the right work experience, you have to be able to allow people to bring all of themselves. And you definitely need to make accommodations for people to feel physically safe. And that's where you get into ideas too, where people are going through gender transitions. If you can create space where people can be physically safe emotionally safe, and bring their whole selves to work, they will perform better. And that's why it really matters in research administration. So what are some best practices that you can incorporate into this? First of all, whether you are a leader in research administration, you see yourself as that, or if you're just a colleague or a collaborator, model those supporting relationships. Turn to a colleague and be open and compassionate and warm and welcoming, because it makes it easier for other people to be open and compassionate and warm and welcoming. If you see something, say something. If you are in a safe place, or you are in a relationship with your colleagues where you can be able to call something out, if someone is discriminated against, say something. Take the time to be able to point it out so that people can learn and that we can move beyond and move into a better space. Make some space for listening. We have this challenge sometimes of liking to hear ourselves and not listening to others. Make sure that you do show concern and empathy. Compassion goes a long way in this world. Use inclusive language. Accommodate people being able to be queer and open. Accommodate people being able to be Black, to be able to use the words that they use to identify themselves. Hispanic, Latinx. Use the words and the language that makes it feel like it's very open and welcoming. Be a little mindful about your curiosity and respecting privacy. One of the challenges in dealing with people with different gender identities, especially if somebody's during a transitional phase, is that unfortunately people start to think about their genitalia. And in no other time in your work does anybody ever think about the genitalia of their colleague. But when someone's going through a transition, that tends to be someplace that they go with curiosity. And that's a time where you can be mindful and help people realize that we don't think about other people's genitalia at work. We just allow people to express themselves and be who they are. We're mindful about our curiosity, and we're always respectful about people's privacy, no matter what it is. Also, become alert to gender and gender neutral spaces. One of the challenges that I have found in my institution historically has a problem with women. It had a big problem with accommodating women, and it's historically known for that. So I work in the physics building, the main physics building that was built 100 years ago. There are 4 toilets for women in this entire building. There are 7 toilets for men in 1 bathroom in this building. It's a sign of the bias that there was against women, which means that there's not always a safe space here for women who are transitioning, for women who are breastfeeding. There's also not a safe space around here if there's just a lot of women in an event going on. So you know what we do? We sometimes flip the gender on one of the larger restrooms and just turn it from a men's room into a women's room when we're having an event, so that there are more stalls. But it took us recognizing that and realizing it, being accountable to it, owning the mistake and fixing it. And that's the other thing, is if you do make a mistake, you call somebody by the wrong gender, you misgender somebody, misname somebody, own it, apologize for it, and move on. Because remember, it's your error. It's your job to be responsible to that person, but it's also not their job to carry the burden of forgiving you. You need to give that opportunity to them to be respectful. We also need to be mindful about how we share, what we share in small groups. For example, on my team, most of us, I think all of us are parents. So it makes it really easy for us to start talking about being parents. But there are plenty of groups where there are people who are involved who are not parents. And you don't want to exclude anybody just because they're not going through that experience. You want to always make sure that you make space for somebody to be able to feel open and welcome, which means you need to find those common grounds and share with yourself and share with others. You need to affirm someone's self-identification, respecting their names and their pronouns. There's a link here on how to handle it if you do make mistakes. I'm a queer person who's been active in all sorts of programs that are queer related. I worked very hard on the marriage equality movement, and I will tell you, I have misnamed people's pronouns many, many, many times. It happens. You can own it, you can fix it, and you can move on. Also, make sure that you share useful resources for others. So when you learn something, you carry it on and let somebody else learn from it too. Look for those opportunities. I mean, they're all here. This is right here. You're looking for opportunities to do it right. And we always need to be aware of our assumptions, our limitations, and our privileges. Because one of the reasons why I'm able to be so open and so out is all of the white privilege that I get, and frankly, even all the white male privilege that I get, because I'm a person who's of a substantial size, and I put off masculine energy, even though I'm in a feminine package. So you need to be aware of these things so that you don't necessarily use bias or get bias used for you in excluding others. Thank you.
Derek, you're on mute, I believe.
I am. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Jim. We have a couple of questions from our audience that I would like to pose to both Sam and Dr. Baker from an HR perspective. One of the main tenets of emotional intelligence, as we know, is mindfulness. When creating job descriptions, how can we be mindful that we're not being exclusionary to really, have some type of biases against people based off of their sexual identity?
Well, that's a Dr. Hall Baker. That's a great question, and I will let her, as the HR expert, answer that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great question. Of course, you know that because you ask it. But it's just really to stick to the facts and stick to what is needed. And you do that by, kind of examining what the need is in the environment and what audience you're serving. And then you build a job description or job announcement based solely on that. I also highly recommend that in that job announcement, based on whatever the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed that need to go directly into that job announcement, is that you make it clear with the diversity statement of some sort that you are open to accepting all applicants of all, types, abilities, and so on. You want to make sure that it's a good idea to take that information directly out of Title V of the protected classes, because sometimes that helps you build a statement that says, I am an institution that's interested in welcoming diversity. And the most important focus for me is the minimum requirements and what we need here in the position to serve whatever need we have existing in the institution. So you want to base it on that. And then when you go into the actual hiring, the recruitment and selection, you make sure that you are checking those biases and you are looking beyond what you see right in front of you, or you're looking beyond what you see in self to find someone who could really come in and serve the institution the way based on the needs of the institution. So I hope that helps.
Very good. Follow-up question is that we also have to look at it from a cultural biases perspective. In a diversified workplace, you have people from varying cultures from all across the globe. How can we put systems in place in order to address cultural biases as it relates to gender identity?
That's a hard one because it crosses gender and other areas. I having experienced it and come to the realization of it living in the Los Angeles area, where I've had very diverse staff. I love that about living here. But I have had issues where there have been assumptions made about female employees of my that are on my team member who were Asian American, and their expectations of the people working with them, specifically faculty members, that they would be deferential and more, frankly, quieter and easier to perhaps convinced to do things the way that they wanted to do things. And when the person didn't react in the way that the cultural assumption was going to be made, I heard about it as the manager, that this person wasn't acting appropriately, and the person was acting completely appropriately. And it was a very difficult conversation because I couldn't call out the bias because the person was a faculty member, and it politically would have been very difficult for me to do that. So instead, I just agreed that, how about in the future, all communication would come by me, and if there was a problem, I would address the problem. And what it essentially accommodated was the ability for the person to see things through a different lens because he knew I was looking at it too. And it got to the place where within a 6-month period, the person went from being thought as not performing the way that the faculty member wanted them to perform to being incredibly valuable, because what that employee had been doing was incredibly precise and very strong and very good and was exactly what needed to be done, and then became, incredibly valuable to that faculty member. It's really challenging because we have the politics involved in this too. And I'd love to hear Dr. Hall Baker and the others speak about that, because that is one of the challenges we run into in higher education, is navigating that political space.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's important that us as individuals and individuals with biases learn about the people we work around. And once you learn about the people we work around, we don't make assumptions of that person. I cannot assume that every person from the LGBTQ community is just like Sam. Because because other factors may be in play. That person may have a different cultural background that causes them to relate to their position in the LGBTQ environment differently than Sam does, because as Sam says, she has some privileges from her perspective. So not only do we need to get knowledge from what we think we may know about a particular group, but we also need to get to know the person as an individual, and know that knowing a person as an individual is your best shot at understanding as a leader, because we all should be focused on being leaders. Knowing that person helps us build relationships and work better in a particular environment with the people that we deal with. I'm a manager a leader who manages a number of people in human resources at our college. And my experience with each individual that I manage is very different. And I make sure that I focus on them with an individualized approach as I begin to learn and work with those people. So I hope that helps.
It does. I like that approach, is to look at the individual versus the collective when you're in your leadership role capacity. Very good discussion, but we're going to now move on to Jared Carroll.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Dr. Hall-Baker, Dr. Westcott, Jami. I appreciate all the information. So much good stuff here. So my name is Jared Carroll. I'm calling in from Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco. And what I want to do is my emphasis is, as Derek said in the intro when he's introducing everyone, is on coaching and facilitating different conversations and speaking, and really holding the spaces for people to process all this stuff. For many of you listening right now, this might be a lot of new information, or maybe you've heard it before, but you're kind of like, oh my gosh, like there's so much to think about. There's so much to, what should I do? What should I say? What can I not say? What am I supposed to do? What am I going to get in trouble for? There are all these reactions and responses and wonderings, and that's natural and that's okay. So what I try and do is hold space for those conversations. So as I'm going through what I'm going to share, think of some of these lenses that I'm going to present as frameworks, as mindsets, as kind of foundational principles that you go about this work. So I guess what I'm saying is, think of them as how do you want to be and less of what to do, because we have and we can continue, and you will continue to get lists of do's and don'ts and this and that, and those are valuable and they're helpful, but if you don't have that foundational about how you approach this work, it's going to be hard to understand how to process everything. So on the next slide, I've in my work, in my coaching work, I've come up with kind of 4 interconnected lenses that I think are really valuable. So the first one is social justice. This work is all about social justice, whether it's ageism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, any of this, it has to be viewed from a social justice perspective. There's always throughout history to 2 minutes ago, a power imbalance in any relationship, whether that's interpersonal, whether it's organizational, whether it's collective. There is always a majoritized, right, a dominant group. It might be men, it might be white people, it might be cisgender, it might be straight people, it might be all of the above, kind of like me, right? If you are the group that is in power, has to recognize that they are in power and decide what to do with that power. Are you going to laud that power over people and perpetuate the inequities? Or are you going to recognize that power and try to share some of the power with people and recognize that there is inequity? Dr. Hall-Baker talked earlier about equity. Equity isn't everyone gets the same thing, it's everyone gets what they need to be successful. And the reason that needs to be in place is because historically, in America and globally, there have been inequities based on race, based on gender, based on all kinds of things that have put certain groups of people with more power and privilege and opportunity than others. And so if we're really looking at it from a social justice lens and we care about everything that we've been talking about, our aim is to disrupt that in our spheres of influence. Now, doesn't mean you have to take over the world. It doesn't necessarily mean who you vote for the president, although that can be part of it. But it's really where do you have potential for change and disruption. So if without that lens, none of this really matters and none of it's going to change. So 3 other lenses. One is, and it was great to hear some of the, excuse me, some of the panelists kind of interjecting some of these things before I get to them, so you're a little bit familiar. EQ. This work takes self-awareness. If you're not aware of who you are, if you're not aware of your privilege, if you're not aware of your power, if you're not aware of your biases that Dr. Hall Baker was talking about, that you have them, excuse me, what they are, why they're harmful, how they perpetuate inequities, then it's going to be really tough to commit to this work. And then empathy, I like to think of empathy as a default disposition. Sometimes we think of empathy as something you do or say or think for someone when something bad or traumatic happens to them. And that is true. But really, I like to think of empathy as a default disposition. Whenever I'm interacting with someone, I'm prepared for the inevitability that there's going to be some sort of something that I need to address. And so empathy means listening, means validating, it means holding space, it means supporting. And that takes vulnerability. If we're not willing to be vulnerable, if we're not willing to be to reveal some of who we are, if we're not willing to recognize that we're all humans, that we all have our individual struggles and we have our collective struggles, if we're not willing to really lean into this work, it's going to be superficial at best and it's going to be performative at worst. And it can be really perpetuating the harm. The third lens that I like to use is mindfulness, and Dr. Westcott brought this into the conversation as well, and I think maybe others did as well. This idea of equanimity. So right now you can probably hear me speaking with some purpose, right? You might say, "Oh wow, he's really passionate." Actually, I'm not passionate. I'm speaking with dispassion because passion gets in the way of my purpose. So it's these little things, these little nuances that are important. Discernment is not the same as judgment. Judgment is, I don't know about that guy. He seems kind of gay, right? That's a judgment on someone's character. Discernment is, you know what? I need to make a decision here because something's not right. And I'm going to really be intentional and think about what I need to do to address that and level the playing field. So there's a difference between discernment and judgment. And then the last kind of component in this mindfulness philosophy is this idea of detachment. There's a difference between being attached to outcomes and being invested in outcomes. So sometimes when we get fired up about this work and we say, gosh, there's so much inequity and I got to change it and I'm going to change the world, and we kind of become bomb throwers, right? We're in the bomb throwing stage of our revolution. We're attached. This has to change. And that might seem good and like you're committed and dedicated, but you can't always control everything. And so how do you find that balance of being committed and invested and keeping consistent and sustained efforts to make the changes that need to happen without being attached to their outcomes? Because when we get attached and they don't happen, or they don't happen as quickly, or they don't happen as thoroughly, it deflates us. And what we can't be is part-time or intermittent advocates for this work, because then it never changes and the status quo remains. And the last lens that I like to emphasize is storytelling. Why do you care about disrupting the status quo? Why do you care about, why are you here today at this webinar? Why do you care about racism? Why do you care about sexism? Why do you care about ageism? It can't just be because it's bad or it's the right thing to do. That might be a start, but actually that's the end. There has to be an origin story. What is your origin story? Why do I care? Why am I a cisgender, straight, white man here on this webinar talking about this, doing this work? So I wouldn't even be here in this world if there was equity. If we lived in an equitable world, I would not be here. You might say, Jared, what are you talking about? Unpack that. Okay, I will. So my dad, before he was my dad, married my mom before she was my mom in 1972 because my dad was gay, but he couldn't tell anyone because in 1972 he could be fired, murdered, all kinds of things for being gay. So he didn't tell the world he was gay, and he did what you're supposed to do, and he married a woman. That woman got pregnant. That woman delivered a baby. That baby was me. So I do this work because it's very personal. So each one of us has to find out what is the personal reason why this work matters to us. It might not come immediately. It might not be as severe or dramatic or traumatic as what I've shared and what other people share, but you have to find that storyline, and you have to amplify your own story and recognize that every other person, whether they share it or not, has their own story as well. And you have to champion all these different stories, the individual stories, the collective stories. And again, coming from that social justice lens. So this work on the next slide takes cultural fluency. So how do you build this cultural fluency? I've been doing this work for about 20 plus years, ever since my dad died of AIDS in 2000. So I've developed my cultural fluency so that I can speak about this with confidence, with competence. So one of the areas that I've been able to do that is by absorbing. I immerse myself in new communities, in new ideas. You can see my background. There's books. You can see the background. There's more books, right? I'm a big reader. I'm a listener. I purposely, intentionally put myself into new situations so I can absorb realities, experiences, truths, perspectives. And then while I'm doing that, I'm also observing where I work, in the community, on the news, in politics, how things are written, whose stories are being shared, whose aren't. I'm observing these power dynamics. I'm like, oh my gosh, what I just saw is what I just read about yesterday. And then I'm making a connection, which is the third approach. I'm connecting. I'm like, what that person just shared about their lived experiences is what I was reading in that book yesterday. And now I'm seeing it and I get it. And that's really important. And the last step is to articulate that you've seen that. And that could manifest in so many different ways. I happen to be a writer. It could be writing, communicating, speaking, standing up for someone in a meeting, going to your boss to file a complaint, all kinds of ways. So once you've absorbed and you understand that things aren't equitable, and you observe it and you're making connections, you're building relationships, you're believing people, you're witnessing people's truths, then you have to articulate it. You have to be a champion. You can't just go, great, I have all this information, I'm just going to keep it to myself. So I'll pause there. I'll turn it back over to Derek. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. And yes, there are questions, and I have a couple myself that I just would like to our esteemed colleagues here. First is, how do we overcome cultural biases and conformity biases within our office as it relates to the microaggressive behavior of faculty and senior leadership, especially in academia?
So great question. I would say everything on this slide is exactly applies to that specific type of situation. If someone's asking about microaggressions, presumably you are familiar with what they are. So you're learning about them, you're understanding that they exist, why they exist. You know some examples, whether they be racial or gender or otherwise, right? So you're absorbing that. Then you're observing them, you're seeing them happen in the workplace. Your colleagues are telling you about them if you didn't see them. Maybe you're even unwittingly doing them, right? So you're making that connection and you're like, okay, what is my recourse of action? I'm not an expert in higher education academia, so I don't know all the politics and bureaucracy that each person would have to go through in their individual organization. but the point is that there are paths. You find allies. You find who's going to be sympathetic to what I'm seeing and the narrative that I'm seeing, and how are they high enough up where they're going to be able to make a decision, or do we need to find someone else? So you have to be strategic. You can't just go to the highest person, because that person might not care. That person might not believe you. That person might not agree with you. That person might be very interested in perpetuating the dominant narrative that's keeping that person in power. So you have to know your people, know your personnel, right? But it has to have some sort of conviction from it, or else you're just gonna go, oh, well, that happened. That sucked. Okay, next. Sam, please.
Derek, if I could just chime in on this, part of it too for research administrators, we have very trusting relationships with our faculty. And there are times that you can actually probably say some things that can make a difference, but it also means that I used to have a saying that fortunately isn't true anymore, but if postdoc tiers or graduate student tiers were nickels, I could have retired years ago, because people will come to me as a trusting source for information or for help within the institution, not always just around research administration. So I will sometimes look for opportunities to be able to correct some things. So I might not be able to go to like the chair of a department and say something, but I know who is the trusting person that has that relationship with the chair. And I've gone to that person and said, could you please have the chair start to look at this? So at my church, we had been going through a reconciliation process over the fact that one of our founding members and one of our members that we had named part of the church campus after was very heavily involved in the eugenics movement. And it was a disgrace. And so our church was doing a lot of historical review and reconciliation and fixing this. And that person was a Caltech faculty member that was revered for decades and had been a former president of Caltech. And I struggled for a long time with, how do I deal with this at Caltech? Because here I am, I'm a cog in the wheel. And how do I get the attention to this at Caltech when I see that this was so wrong, and I know that it really makes sense for us to do this reconciliation process? And then the conversation started to happen naturally at Caltech, and I immediately reached out when I saw them happening to the person that was leading it at Caltech, and it got them connected with the person leading it at my church. And then I just stepped back, and the two of them were able to share resources, and it's brought it all down. So like the buildings are no longer named. There are statues that have been removed, busts of people that have been removed from the campus, all around this. And it was, all I did was just introduce one person to another person, because I was in both spaces. So sometimes you just have to, like you say, you observe it, you figure it out, and then you look for that opportunity to try to make it a little better. It's not easy. There's not like automatic responses to things, but that's where I've found it.
I would like to chime in. Politics are real, and you have to determine whether or not you want to deal with it or not. My answer to that is be bold, be an ally, learn allyship, call the behavior out if you're willing to do that. And then if you don't see change, determine whether or not you want to be a part of this environment, this culture, and start, figuring out where you really want to be as a person who has a foundation that is rooted in DEI. So, I mean, that's an approach you could take. However, I know we all need our jobs. So at least I do. So if, considering politics are real and that being bold can be risky sometimes, you kind of have to look at all of that before you put yourself out there to kind of go against what you may see as an injustice or an inequity.
Well, just a follow-up question to that, Dr. Baker, is that most of us work in academia. And the perception is in academia, especially for those in our line of profession, is that HR hasn't always been an ally in order to address microaggression. Why? Because the number one commodity, other than the human capital that a leader is supposed to protect, is the investigator who has the scientific merit. How do we address that inequity to make sure in the age of diversity, equity, inclusion, that we are being mindful of the fact that that behavior cannot be tolerated?
Again, it's changing the culture. This is not a perfect science, because although it seems really obvious that this is the way it should be, a lot of times getting there is not easy at all, and it takes a lot of time to do so. we talk in my institution, we talk about moving the needle a lot, but every year we look at the stats, we do that diversity report, and we realize that with all of our efforts, moving that needle is not as easy as we think. So you have to start, as I tell my children, one brick at a time, one person at a time, by, bringing more diversity or DI focused speakers to the institution, going to each discipline, academic discipline, and talking to them from the inside out, or from, the bottom to the top, changing the minds of the leaders, like the chairs and, the administrators in the environment, because it's going to take a holistic approach to make that change, and not just, again, going to the leaders, because sometimes it has to be a grassroots effort from the bottom to the top. So that's something to consider. But again, it's not a perfect science, and it does take a lot of hard work. And don't depend on, I have to say this, don't depend on the minorities in the environment to do the work. We have to do the work collectively. We cannot depend on, our people with maybe a different ability than we do, or our minorities, our Latinx, our LGBTQ community. We have to take a bold stand as an individual in a position of power to help make the changes.
Yep.
For that answer. Would anyone else like to chime in on that, Jami?
Yeah, I think I think it's important that understanding that we're all leaders, regardless of where we sit on the org chart. And if you got to have people who've got to be willing to listen. We talked about the term inclusiveness earlier, and so we have to understand that. And then going to the leaders, whether it's the dean or the chairs or the president, if we're going to be a workforce that respects people and their views, then we have to be willing to listen, because we're all different and we're not all the same, and we all have opinions, and we have. And then there's that word respect.
Mm-hmm. Another question to our panelists is that last year, after we saw the Black Lives Matter movement that sprung up after the tragic murder of George Floyd, a lot of corporations put out diversity, equity, inclusion statements. How can we, in stealing from Dr. Baker, from a grassroots perspective, hold our institutions accountable for the statements that they put out in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
It's a challenging one, because it depends on your institution too, and how much farther they have to go towards that change, because there are institutions who are a lot further along in this process. My institution is very slow. Caltech is very slow to change. It's very slow to change in a lot of ways, because they've done things, the way that they've done things for years, and they're really well known. So why would we change that? And changing that expectation so I work for a division chair, it's the first female division chair in what is the largest division, physics, mathematics, and astronomy at Caltech. And we do some amazing science, and she has transformed the division and has really worked very hard to make the division much more open and welcoming. And we've gone out and actively created programs to recruit underrepresented minorities out of some of the great schools, so they'll come here as a graduate school. But one of the things we have to make sure we do is that we don't expect them to change the organization from the inside out. Caltech is an incredibly stressful place to work. It's an incredible stressful place to be a student. And we can't expect these graduate students to come in and change the culture from the ground up. So we have to look for those opportunities from every aspect, which means that I feel like I just have to be mindful of it and look for those opportunities and see what I can do. I talk about it with my peers across the campus. I talk about it with my peers across the field, because there's no quick answer. It really has to be a slow, like Dr. Hallbaker said, it's an iterative process of one brick at a time, but making sure that it's building a structure that's going to last, and it's not just token words.
Yeah, and I would say whatever the organization. So I've been working on a long-term contract for about 15 months now at a Fortune 500 tech company, and I started actually my first day. I want to say it was like June 11th. So about 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd. And one of the very first documents I read when I was brought on was the CEO statement from the CEO of that company, who put out a statement like June 2nd or June 3rd or something, a week after George Floyd was murdered. And I read it, And it was, you know, it was okay, but it was the same as like every other statement that had been coming out at that time. And so what I've been doing, um, and to your point, Dr. Westcott, like it takes time. You're not gonna go in and say, hey, you need to change, and then a CEO or a leader or the head of a department isn't gonna go, oh gosh, you're right, let's just change it, right? There's so much power resisting that change. Personal, collective, institutional, there's caution, there's political, there's all kinds of things. So what I've been doing for 15 months, and it sometimes feels like it's just not, there's no change, nothing's not happening, but there are little wins. I'm finding now that especially I've been there, I know more of the executive team and I know who gets it. I know who has more fluency than others. I know the CEO has a decent level of fluency, but I also know that he is the CEO. I know the CMO has maybe a little bit less fluency, but I know that he wants to learn. So I work with him. I know the CHRO doesn't give anything. So I'm like, forget her. I'm not trying to work with her. She's a barrier. That's something to be, to think about. But what am I going to do? Right? And so you have to know your people and you have to keep being persistent, keep being that voice, even if it feels like you're shouting into this canyon that no one's hearing you. You have to keep being that voice and keep building those relationships. And over time, it will affect change, even if it feels like it's glacial.
Well, a follow-up question to that is how can an individual do that without actually being a target of microaggressions themselves?
It's a good question. I recognize that I have a couple privileges. One, being a cis straight white male puts me in a position of privilege. So I use that to my advantage. Also, I'm a consultant. So even though I've been at this company for a long time, I'm still technically a consultant. So I have a little less risk of losing my job or being punished. That said, it depends on as someone said earlier, I can't remember who it was, your level of comfort about how much this means to you. Are you willing to absorb that criticism, those microaggressions, that discomfort, that challenge to stand up for what you believe in? And without knowing every individual case, I don't think any of us can really answer that except for the person whose situation it is. So it's not that those aren't going to happen or that they're not harmful and hurtful, but it does become, all right, how much do I care about this, and how much of my privilege am I going to leverage to make change versus how much of my privilege am I going to leverage to keep the status quo because it's too hard?
Right.
I just want to add, I agree with what Jared said, but here's another piece to it. Sometimes data speaks louder than words. So if you know an institution that has the diversity or even close to the diversity that you're looking for, start tracking that institution and sharing that data with your institution to help affect change. So that means that if this institution is, thriving in diversity and they're seeing higher rates, higher graduation rates, higher success rates, and all of the different areas of the institution, mirror that institution and present that information to the people at your institution to try to help you move the needle. I have a lot of colleagues that say, I'm a visual learner, and sometimes having that visual is really helpful.
That's a really valid point, especially at institutions where rankings are everything. Because I use a whiteboard when I train people. I use a whiteboard just to write down what I'm working on for faculty members, not because I need my to-do list on my whiteboard, but because when faculty come and visit me and they see somebody else is already ahead of them in line, they then come and tell me that they need me to do something for them too. The rankings make a huge difference in academics. That's a great piece of advice.
I like that concept, how it's the approach that you take and having the ability to present a material in a manner which can be more receptive for your target audience. At this point, though, I would like to shift the conversation back to ageism. And one of the terms that we had in this presentation, if I'm not mistaken, was different abilities. And is that a term that we should start using more so than using disabilities? You know, just to make sure that we're being more mindful of how we talk about these issues.
I mean, that's an interesting point, Derek. If you recall, many years ago, we used to use the word handicap. And then
Correct.
we went to disability. And one of the things I've already said, being deficient or being disabled only means that you're different, but it doesn't mean that you're deficient. It just means you have a different ability. So that's very true, and that's something to think about.
It's also could go to like asking people to define themselves. You know, I mean, like I know that there have been so many labels when we talk about, you know, labels that are queer and where people feel comfortable gendering, you know, with their gender labels or their queer identified labels. You know, cisgendered people don't call themselves cisgendered people. They just call themselves male or female because that was the norm. But then people started to identify it, and that lack of a term meant that people went to go look for cisgendered. But in our conversation just the other day, there was a question about whether or not that was the right thing to do, because cis means aligned and trans means like moving differently, and that didn't necessarily reflect what, you know, what people feel, because there's biases with those words. So I think that maybe what we need to do is we need to be more open to saying, how, you know, like, how do you want to be called? What would you like me to, you know, like, how do you address yourself? How do you define yourself? And maybe let people call themselves that, because, you know, I certainly have had friends who've said that, you know, that they identify as Black, not African American. I think that we need to allow people to identify themselves. I mean, you know, bless you, Jared, for calling me Dr. Westcott, but Dr. Westcott was both of my parents. I am not a PhD or an MD. No, it's totally fine. It's good to be deferential to that and defer to that in academia. But I always like tell people immediately when they meet me to call me Sam, because that's the name I prefer. And I don't have a problem with people calling me Samantha. It's long and it's formal and it doesn't fit me. So I prefer Sam, and I tell people that. And I think maybe we should get to that place where we feel comfortable enough saying, how would you like to be addressed? How would you like to be referred to? You know, because our gender is not who we are. You know, our abilities are not who we are. Our age is not who we are. You know, I'm a cisgendered lesbian, Generation X, you know, able, and have been in research administration for years. And I always make that joke because I've been around for a long time. And I know that, you know, like I say I'm Generation X, and that's relatively vague because you don't know where I fall in that generation. But if you look me up, you can find out that I've been around for a very long time. So.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank each one of our panelists for this excellent discussion that we've had today regarding isms. I personally learned a lot, and as you can see, I took a lot of notes. And we also have resources, as you can see on our screen here for you. And I highly encourage each of you, especially those that are interested in working in the DEI space, to take a look at some of these references that we have and learn. The more you know, the more you can grow within this field. And I personally would like to thank each and every one of you who have participated within the session. Our guests, our people who are joined, that are watching this webinar. And thank you for allowing me to be the host of this particular webinar. I have grown immensely from just being part of the dialogue and conversation.